Morning, and many thanks for joining this webinar on the retail sector and what we've seen in the real estate market since COVID-19. I'm Guy Whitehead. I'm a Senior Associate in the Real Estate Department at Irwin Mitchell. I'm going to be hosting the webinar this morning, looking at the impact of COVID-19 has had on lease provisions, and whether we're starting to see a shift towards a more collaborative approach between landlords and tenants.
Hi, I'm Laura. I am a solicitor in the real estate transactional team in Leeds, and I'm going to be talking about the concessions that we've seen that have been made between landlords and tenants, how these have been documented, and the wider implications.
And good morning, my name is Megan Forbes and I'm a solicitor here in the planning and environmental team at Irwin Mitchell. I'm going to be talking about some of the recent changes we've seen to the planning system and how it gives you the opportunity to adapt your business. And I'll be joined by Nicole Roe, who is Director of Eden Planning, to pick her brains on some of the changes and see what she thinks.
So all of our contact details are on the slides, so please feel free to get in touch after the webinar if you have any questions or if you just want to connect on LinkedIn. We've also managed to secure 2 high caliber external speakers. I'm going to be posing some questions to Simon Morris, who's the Managing Partner of retail agency GCW. And as Megan just mentioned, Megan's going to be joined by Nicole Roe, Director of Eden Planning. Just like to say thank you to both of them for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us this morning. There's also going to be an opportunity for us to answer some of your questions in the chat box, and the webinar has also been recorded and we posted on YouTube after the event. You're also going to receive a link for you to leave some feedback. So the background to the webinar is a report that was commissioned by the consumer sector at Irwin Mitchell, titled The Consumer Sector and the Changing Consumer. The report gathered insight from clients in the wider network and focused on changes in consumer behaviour due to Brexit and COVID-19 and how businesses have adapted. Some of the key findings to come out of the report were 61% of consumers have changed stores, brands, or the way they shop since the pandemic began, and 30% of retail trade is now done online. Copies of those reports are available on Irwin Mitchell's website. So what have we seen in the retail sector over the last 15 months? I'm sure everyone on the webinar will be all too aware of the unprecedented levels of disruption that the sector has faced and is continuing to face since COVID hit. See recent reports concerning Gap closing their retail estate and going online. The demise of high-profile retail institutions such as Debenhams, Arcadia Group illustrates fundamental change in the high street as we know it. It's certainly sad to see the number of empty units on Fargate in Sheffield, which once would have been considered a prime retail location. Store closures and a reduction in footfall mean some retailers can be expected to focus their efforts on fewer high-performing stores and trying to find ways to stay relevant to their consumers, whether through the use of experiential retail or simply by adapting their operations to get customers through their doors. On a more positive note, it was good to see reports this morning that good weather and the summer of sport have helped retailers record the fastest quarterly growth on record. Sales rose by 13.1% in June compared with the same month in 2019. That's according to the retail sales monitors compiled by the British Retail Consortium. We're going to give you the information that you need from a legal perspective to mitigate risks and to help you navigate your way through these challenging times. I'm now going to hand over to Laura, who's going to take us through our first case study. So Laura, what concessions have we seen in the market during the pandemic?
I think all sorts is the answer, really. The key to this is that many retailers have had to close or reduce numbers, and many have struggled to pay their rents as a consequence. Landlords don't want to be faced with empty units and so have to pay rates and service charge and insurance liabilities for the unit. And this has led to creative ways of thinking. And I think it's fair to say that there's been no one size fits all approach. So some of the things that we have seen, firstly, are rent-free periods, and these have been for different lengths of time depending on the circumstances, but we have seen rent-free periods of up to 6 months. We've seen rent repayment plans or rent concessions, which reduce the rent or allow arrears to be paid over a longer time in instalments. We've seen capital contributions made by landlords for tenants' refurbishment works, so that the tenants can refurbish their premises and hopefully get a larger audience. Something I've seen quite frequently is monthly rather than quarterly rent repayments being allowed to assist a tenant's cash flow. Something that is becoming more common now are assignments or under leases of part. These allow flexibility so that a retailer can downsize, allow concessions, repurpose a space, and so that an income stream can be brought from parts of a unit that's not being used. And also changes of use, so relaxation of the user clause within a lease to allow a wider variety of activities to be undertaken, which is something that Megan will look at during her case study.
So Laura, how can these concessions be documented?
I think that's a good question, and I think it's something that you need a solicitor to make sure that they've drafted it properly for you. There are various methods of documenting concessions, and often it'll be guided by how far-reaching the concessions are or how long an impact that they should have. They need to be drafted properly to make sure that they have the correct effect. So one of the ways is side letters. These are documents that are supplemental to the lease, and things that you need to consider are that they need to be drafted carefully to make sure that they're a binding contract so that they're enforceable. A landlord or a tenant doesn't want to challenge and find that they can't enforce the provisions that have been agreed. They can cause some uncertainty as they sit alongside a lease. They you need to check what's in the lease. Are there any break rights or rent reviews that could occur at the same time as a rent-free period, for example? And tenants need to consider whether these can fall away, and indeed landlords as well. I have seen side letters allowing reduced rents for certain periods, but if the tenant defaults in repaying the rent, then the full annual rent is due immediately. So there are consequences. Another method are deeds of variation, which vary the lease itself, and then the usual forfeiture provisions and all the other provisions in the lease remain. Lease re-gears are becoming more common, which is essentially replacing one lease with another on renegotiated terms because the market no longer reflects the deal that was agreed. So a new lease can be entered into, or again, a deed of variation can be done to affect this. And finally, reversion releases. These are becoming much more common, which adds a new lease on to the end of the current term. So to extend it for 6 months, a year, 5 years.
So Laura, can you tell me about the wider implications and things to watch out for?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And when agreeing concessions, we need to consider the impacts on other clauses in the lease. So, for example, rent reviews. If a rent-free period's been given, is there a rent review that needs to be moved or removed? If a capital contribution's been made, should the works be rentalised and so the tenant pay for some of the works back? If there's a reversion release, if there's a rent review on day one, it needs to be carefully drafted to make sure that the rent review takes effect properly. If there is a break clause in the lease, it needs to be clearly defined. Ideally, and the landlord will want to ensure that all the annual rents have been paid up to date, and they may want all of the rents in the lease to have been paid. A tenant will want to ensure that these have been demanded in writing to make sure that the break clause can be effected correctly. Is the document and concession to be personal to the parties? For example, if the landlord's to sell the reversion, what will happen? Is it intended to be passed on? Is there a lender involved? Some concessions require their consent, so that's important to obtain if needed. The landlord needs to think about, do they want something in return for a concession? Do they want the break removed from the lease, or the term to be extended at the end of the term to be extended at the end of the lease? And if a term is extended in a lease, it needs to be thought about how it's going to be done. If a deed of variation is entered into, this would effectively mean that the lease is being surrendered and re-granted, which may mean stamp duty land tax is repayable, and that's probably a consequence that a tenant with cash flow problems would like to avoid. And then there's reversion releases to extend the term. In relation to reversion releases as well, these need to be linked to the existing lease so that it makes one long lease in theory, so that both have to be assigned together. If there's any break clauses in the lease, they are removed. The rent review dates flow throughout. The repair and yield up obligations they need to follow through from the start of the current lease. If there are any guarantors, are they going to be released, or is it intended that they will be parties to any new documents? And finally, the 1954 Act security of tenure. If the current lease is excluded, obviously it will probably follow that any reversion release or new lease would be as well. But it's important to think, if a reversion release is being granted as a short-term lease, as an extension at the end of the term due to a 3-month rent-free period, then that final lease may not have security of tenure. And is it worth losing security of tenure for a short rent-free period? Conversely, if the lease is being granted with security of tenure, so say a 1-year lease at the end of the lease, on similar to a landlord will need to re-grant a lease on similar terms. So that could include a short term, and that could be highly detrimental to a landlord's reversion or the value of the landlord's reversion. So I think there's a lot to think about, and it's obvious that one thing can impact on another. There's a whole host of options, and these will differ depending on the landlord, the tenant, the business, the location. But a landlord and tenant need to have open and honest conversations and work together if there are any difficulties, so that they can agree a plan. Tenants who prepare well are likely to see more favourable results, and so should provide data as to how a concession would benefit both parties. It's important that landlords and tenants speak to a solicitor and an agent to prepare properly for any conversations and make sure that they haven't missed anything. And as I said at the beginning, there's no one size fits all. When deals are being agreed, parties need to consider not only the short-term implications, but the longer-term implications of what they're agreeing. So I'll hand back to Guy now for the second case study.
Thanks, Laura. I'm now going to look into what effect COVID-19 has had, it's going to have on lease provisions, whether we're starting to see a more transparent and collaborative approach between landlords and tenants, with a rebalancing of risk, with a concerted shift in leasing practice. To a certain extent, it was inevitable that both landlords and tenants would seek to introduce novel provisions into leases, whether entering into new leases and on renewal, where the rule is that a tenant's only entitled to a lease in the same terms as the existing lease, say for reasonable modernisation.
Guy, which lease provisions have come under scrutiny then?
I think it's fair to say that all lease provisions have been under the microscope over the last 15 months, but those subject to the most scrutiny were unsurprisingly rental provisions, service charge clauses and tenant covenants.
What do you think the shape of the future retail lease is?
So looking first at rental provisions, more retailers are likely to request certainty of all-inclusive rents, or leases where the rent includes all outgoings, as they seek to crystallise the amount of their monthly or quarterly outgoings. There seems to be a shift in demand from retailers for turnover leases in the market, with options being where the retailer pays a percentage of turnover, typically between 1 to 15%, or a pure turnover lease, or a hybrid where the tenant pays a reduced fixed base rent with a turnover top up in addition to the base rent, but only where turnover exceeds the base rent, or otherwise known as a turnover top up lease. I've seen some reports that some established retailers are publicly making the case for turnover rent-based leasing arrangements. So we could potentially be on the verge of a widespread move towards turnover-based leases, but I suppose unsurprisingly there's going to be some hesitancy from landlords to offer turnover leases until such time as they know and are happy that footfall is going to return to pre-COVID levels. Another problem is or issue is business rates. Obviously, big issue for tenants, and it can affect availability for whether a retailer actually takes on a store. I've seen some examples where landlords are willing to let out stores for a peppercorn rent. The retailer being required to cover a store's outgoings, including business rates and utilities. Understandably, one of the most contentious topics to emerge out of COVID-19 is the issue of pandemic rent and service charge suspension or deferments, with these measures applying whilst the store is closed due to the pandemic. If you look back to the first lockdown in March 2020, retailers were basically reliant on the goodwill of their landlords, and unsurprisingly, they're now looking to make sure that if there's another lockdown going forward, the rental provision is going to be agreed in advance. The code of practice for the commercial property sector, which was issued by the government in June last year, set out the full range of possible options, including a full rent suspension to a partial rent deferment for predefined periods, or any combination between, or a temporary switch to turnover rents, including the period of closure. So issues for the landlords to consider include whether the tenants are able to obtain business interruption insurance. Obviously, if they are, then potentially the tenant should be offered the suspension or deferments. If a landlord's minded to accept a suspension or deferment, should this be limited to an agreed percentage? I think 50-50 split is fairly common, and they also need to think about whether this should be covered in the lease itself or in a side letter, on the basis that any such suspension or deferment is personal to the tenant but binding on any successor entitled to the landlord. I think this is going to be a hotly contested issue in the context of lease renewals, and whether tenants will be able to successfully argue that the inclusion of pandemic rent or suspension or deferment provisions constitutes reasonable modernisation of an existing lease, in the same way that the inclusion of a carve-out for uninsured risks is now considered, is now accepted in the industry. My own view is that we're still some way off this being the case. We've definitely seen a move away from longer lease terms, with a gradual reduction in lease terms to extend at 5 and 3 leases, or leases with 5-year terms with options to break after 3 years, and even 3 and 1 leases, again 3-year terms with options to break after a year, are now prevalent in the market. And another hot topic will be rent reviews. Retailers are going to be reluctant to accept upwards only open market reviews, which is understandable really, given reports that on average, depending on whether the store is located on a high street, shopping centre, retail park, leisure scheme, retailers are typically asking for an average 30% reduction in rental levels across their estates. So it's inevitable to a certain extent that retailers will request upwards downwards rent reviews to enable rent to be reduced to market rent. Again, this is going to be a hotly contested topic in the context of lease renewals. Tenants may also be unwilling to provide guarantors that can be called upon during a pandemic, with an increasing number of landlords requesting rent deposits to give them the security they need that we use to discharge unmet rental liabilities.
Thanks, Guy. What changes have you seen to service charge provisions?
Well, the changes tend to focus on what services the landlords are required to provide, and how retailers are going to manage those resulting costs. So retailers want to impose obligations on their landlords to provide any additional services that are required to comply with guidelines given by the government in respect of common parts. Now that shopping centres have reopened, I think we've all seen and witnessed the extension measures that landlords have to put in place for the health and safety of staff and their customers. As a result of this, we're likely to see a shake-up of the standard list of services to be provided by landlords. On the other hand, tenants will be keen to ensure that service charge payments are reduced if the closure of a shopping centre results in cost savings to the landlord. And also, obviously, tenants will want those savings to be passed on immediately rather than having to wait until the service charge reconciliation at the end of a service charge year. Something else that we've seen are tenants seeking service charge caps, especially if there's a significant burden placed onto landlords to increase the range and frequency of services, such as intense cleaning regimes. And I think there's also likely to be a far more examination around service charge exclusions, with landlords keen to ensure there are no recoverability gaps and tenants keen to ensure they're receiving value for money. Landlords will also want to exclude the liability to provide services in the event that they are unable to do so because of a lockdown. They want to exclude liability if it becomes uneconomical to open common parts for a small number of essential retailers, or if the closure is beyond the guidance issued by Public Health England at that time.
And what about tenants' covenants?
So in terms of tenants' covenants, the changes tend to focus on giving retailers flexibility in order to adapt their operations quickly and without requiring landlords' consent. So in terms of opening provisions, tenants will seek to introduce caveats that they will not breach their keep open covenant if store closures are imposed by the government. They may also want to release from their keep open covenants if a shop is forced to close because pandemic footfall has dropped below a certain specified level, meaning it's not viable to open. In terms of user, it's been impressive to see retailers finding innovative ways to operate during the lockdown. One consequence is tenants are likely to demand wider user clauses to give them scope to change their operations without landlords' consent during the pandemic, to be able to benefit from different income streams, such as takeaway, delivery services, and obviously provided that any such alternative use is authorised by planning. Retailers will also be keen to ensure they're not frustrated when being able to comply with the yielding up provisions in their leases if they can't instruct their contractors to carry out exit works due to a pandemic. They may subsequently ask for yielding up obligations to be deferred until such time as the retailer is able to access the premises, the landlords being prevented from serving schedules of dilapidations in the meantime. Retailers will also want to be able to make alterations to their premises which are required by the government, again without landlord consent, as part of the protective measures that are put in place to protect both their staff and customers. Additionally, retailers will be able to respond quickly to the effect that changes in shopping habit may have on the layout of the store. For example, if less changing rooms are required and they need more click and collect and return points.
Thanks, guys. So what does the future hold?
I suppose that's the million-dollar question. It's obviously difficult to predict, but I suppose it's worth mentioning that the government has announced in December 2020 its intention to review a broad range of issues, including the security of tenant provisions containing the Landlord and Tenants Act 1954, which would, if modified, obviously be a major shake-up for the industry and the impact of coronavirus on the market. The review will be conducted by the Law Commission and will examine how landlords and their tenants can better collaborate together, consider how the lease process can be reviewed and improved to ensure high streets recover from the pandemic. Its remit is expected to be broad, covering rents, lease models and forfeiture. So I'm now going to pick up on some of these issues with Simon Morris. Simon, can you tell me about the type of work you carry out at GCW and who you act for?
Certainly. So GCW are town centre specialists, so historically from a retailer background, but we identified the changes which were occurring in consumer habits about sort of 6-7 years ago, pivoted our business. So we act for a broad cross section. So yes, traditional retailers, so the likes of JD, all the way down to sort of micro or smaller, more entrepreneurial businesses like Farrow Ball, Jojo Maman Baby, Equally, what you might call alternative occupiers, but increasingly they're just part of the town centre landscape. So urban self-storage, retirement living, education, medical users, and then the traditional supermarket operators as well. And then the thing which gives us a bit of a kind of keeps us kind of with an even keel is that we also act for most of the major pension institutional investors, propcos and private individuals, and private individuals are taking a bigger slice of the investment market, particularly at the moment, whilst debt's proving to be a more scarce thing to secure.
So from your experience, Simon, were landlords generally willing to offer rental concessions when COVID hit and stores were forced to close?
I think there's not a straightforward yes or no answer to that. It's much more nuanced. It slightly depends on who the landlord is and who the occupier was as well. It's been well documented in the kind of popular press around occupiers who were trading all the way through, and some reporting some pretty historic high turnovers and contributions from those stores, yet we're still refusing to pay rent or seeking a concession. And there's a number of cases ongoing around rent recovery and challenges around debt recovery for those sums. I think where we found it is generally where occupiers have been able to demonstrate that they weren't able to trade, and equally that there's been an impact, then yes, there has been some concessions. Generally where landlords have tried to strike a balance, we found is there something which can be offered by the retailer, which might even be a no-cost option. So it might be agreeing to share store performance information, so turnover information. Yes, there are other things around removing breaks or extending terms, but we found that where there's a sensible dialogue between both parties, actually we've been able to reach an agreement. I think the big challenge is the balloon of debt which remains and how that's dealt with, because the government guidance is frankly no clearer. There is the kind of the proposal around arbitration on this, yet the basis of that arbitration and who's going to undertake it still is muddied, and so I don't really see how we're going to easily clear that balloon of debt before the time frame runs out.
Okay, so potentially choppy waters ahead then.
Indeed.
Yeah. So do you think COVID accelerated changes that we're already seeing in the market, which saw retailers who are unwilling to adapt their business models going under?
Absolutely. COVID didn't create anything new. To take your point, it's just merely accelerated the changes that we'd all already seen happening anyway. The consumer and how and why they engage with places and occupiers fundamentally has been changing for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Those occupiers who haven't responded to it and so haven't had a more harmonized approach, either had a single strategy or don't offer a point of difference, the squeezed middle, they're those occupiers who have suffered most and gone through insolvency procedures and maybe don't exist in the way that they did before. I think it's too easy to simply blame COVID as being the reason why our business has failed. Certainly from our experience, we haven't seen that scenario.
Okay, and what impact have you seen on rental levels, and is there essentially a polarised market between out of town shopping centres and the high street? And if so, how do secondary retail areas make themselves relevant and attractive destinations for consumers?
So at a high level, high street town centre rents had already started to cool by early 2020 by about 30% from highs achieved in the 3 years prior to that. COVID's broadly taken another 30% off that level. Now, it's not uniform because effectively, in the same way as I'm talking about occupiers that are in this squeeze middle, we're finding towns that are in the squeeze middle as well, where you've either got to be local to where people live and work, or you need to be offering something more, and I'm desperately trying to avoid using the word experiential because it's so overused, but there's got to be something more for the people to come to. Those locations have suffered less. rents have fallen at a much lower level. They have still fallen though. Where you found a bigger trough is when you're looking at those towns which neither end of the spectrum, and they've got the biggest issue, and they have the biggest oversupply of secondary retail. Now, where that sits at the tail end of a retail pitch or a town centre, it's easier to hive it off and then look at pure alternative use, residential being the most obvious. Where quite often we find there's anchors at either end of the town and there's that broken teeth effect of oversupply in the middle, that becomes a more challenging aspect to overcome. And residential concerns me, in particular the relaxation of planning laws, which I'm sure might be brought on later, but is around with a fragmented ownership in high street retail particularly, do you end up with low quality housing or low quality solutions which actually further exacerbate and hasten the decline of the town centre and the purpose behind it? In terms of the difference between in town and out of town, I think out of town has fared a little better for the most part because of its accessibility, but in the long term you've got to look at why out of town's been successful. It's been able to provide large space at low cost with free car parking. Well, actually, large space is coming in town centres. It's a fundamentally nicer environment for people to spend time. And if you look at the take up of driving licenses and car ownership, particularly in younger age groups, then maybe that becomes a declining market.
Do you think rental levels have bottomed out then, in terms of going down?
I think largely they have. I do have this concern over some of these locations in the squeeze middle area, and so if you look at what's happening in a Swindon or a Northampton maybe as examples, is there further to go whilst it repositions itself? Potentially there is, but I think for the most part we've seen a bit of a settlement. It does come to your point though around what happens to turnover, and does turnover start to become a bigger proportion of new deals particularly, and what's the balancing effect of that?
I was just going to come on to that in terms of, have you seen a shift in the market for turnover lease to shorter lease terms?
Yeah, shorter lease terms, absolutely. I mean, to an extent, it's related to the amount of capex that an occupier is going to be spending on the space. So you tend to find with food and beverage occupiers, large amounts of capex needs to be written off over a longer period, hence the longer leases. Likewise, occupiers that are taking large space, 20, 30,000 square feet, again, quite like longer period of time because it assists with that write-off. But for the most part, yes, 5-year terms, and it's not unusual to have a break at year 3. In terms of turnover, we're finding that it's particularly being pushed by fashion occupiers, but it's a tricky point, and this is probably a bit of a sensitive area to get into, but it's actually what you tend to find from occupiers is what they would like to do is pay the least amount of occupational cost. And so I've had a conversation this morning with an international fashion brand, absolutely fantastic. So on the moment, but they're saying to us, well, actually, we don't really want to pay a turnover rent because we're concerned that we'll turn over too much. So we want to pay the lowest rent possible, and we sort of want you to share the risk as a landlord by incentivizing us as such and providing us with additional elements. But when it comes to sharing that risk, we really want to throttle it. Now, maybe in that scenario, that landlord's saying, well, actually, this is game changing. It really helps enhance this asset and we can leverage it for other occupiers. So they're able to take that risk. But there is that point where, is it just about driving the lowest occupational costs? And if that's the case, is turnover right? Or should we really be talking about performance-led leasing? And that's about incorporating the total value of the property asset to the occupier, which includes branding, yes, sales through the till, click and collect, return, halo effect in terms of how that translates to online sales, all of which are measurable. And actually, if you start to bring all of those different threads in, maybe you do come to a more equitable solution. Although the thing which I would say is occupiers collaborate and so will achieve more than landlords. So occupiers collaborate, they all want the same thing, which is to reduce lower costs. So they talk about turnover and trying to bring that down. landlords are in a muddle as to how they want to achieve a different type of leasing model. And even when we're talking, we're engaged with the IPF and a number of the larger landlords about looking at different leasing models. What you tend to find is each of them has their own little nuance on it, and that doesn't help them achieve a common goal.
Oh, that's okay. Do you think there'll be greater diversification of uses for the high street with the move away from retail to leisure and residential?
Absolutely, and I think it's essential. I think to in many respects, we need to reverse ourselves back. We're certainly looking across the presenting panel, we're probably all too young to go back to 1960, but it's almost that element of retail, for the most part, will no longer be, and hasn't been for some time really, the primary reason why people visit places. So actually what we need to do is have more diversity of uses and bring back some of those things which used to be stalwarts of our high street. Retail only became the primary use on the high street because it priced out everything else. There are higher values attributable to it. Actually, if you bring back living, you bring back education, you bring back medical, you bring in leisure, you create better environments for people to spend time in, and public realm is an absolutely key part of that, then you will create successful locations. But yes, so I'm absolutely to that point, which is it has to be a diverse offer.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing a shift in Sheffield and an approach by Sheffield City Council on that basis as well. So I suppose this is the $1 million question, Simon. Where do you think the retail sector will be in 12 months' time?
I think it'll be in a better place than it is at the moment. Fingers crossed that there's a gradual understanding that we're not going to be in and out of lockdowns and other things, because so it's less disrupted. And I think what will happen is occupiers will learn more about what they need to provide to their customer, and that stores aren't simply a place to complete a transaction, that actually it's a much more harmonized offer. And so I think we could end up with some really, really interesting stores and some concepts which are maybe quite large at the moment, looking at having sort of micro or local offers closer to where people live and work. I think we will start to see that diversity, but I think a big challenge is where does the capital come to provide the redevelopment from, because debt just isn't there, and with depressed values it makes it very difficult, even when debt is there, to support redevelopment. So who fronts that? And if that's local authorities, how do they politically do it, and how do they do it at a pace to respond? Because we need to be real that we shouldn't be making knee-jerk decisions. They've got to be well thought out, but the world's changed very, very quickly and people need to respond to that. I don't think somebody delivering something in 7 years, people will have started going to other places. Then your place will have to fight so much harder to get people back. So I think it's about acting now.
Okay. And just obviously touching on what I was saying my part as well, do you think we'll see a shift towards a more collaborative approach between landlords and tenants, and there'll ever be a rebalancing of that risk?
Yes, I'm hopeful that there will be, and that it will feel that it's that there's less kind of butting of heads. I think turnover or performance leasing should help to bring that forwards, although that's more likely to happen in shopping centres than in the high street. I think the thing which I would be saying and have said for quite some time is, if you're an investor in retail property, it becomes increasingly difficult to look at it as a financial instrument. You've got to understand why people engage with that business, and then is that sustainable? And simply looking at a set of accounts to assess covenant in most instances isn't necessarily going to buy you a sustainable investment. So I think there has to be that degree of collaboration. I'm going to say yes, I'm going to be positive, Guy, and I'm going to say yes, it's going to happen, but it's going to take time to get there. But I also think you'll end up with a slight change in ownership, and as you end up with a change of ownership, the new breed buying in at today's levels will probably have to recognise that collaboration is a key part of owning retail property.
Good. Well, thanks for your comments, Simon. I'm great. I'm now going to hand over to Megan, who's going to take us through the recent changes to the planning regime.
Good morning. Yes, so by way of introduction, I am a solicitor in the planning team here. So I'm just going to be focusing on a lot of the changes that we've seen in the past year. Obviously, the planning system has always been quite rigid, quite strict, and as a result of consumer habits changing and predominantly as a result of the pandemic, the planning system has actually adapted quite quickly, and we've seen a lot more change in the past year than I think we would probably normally see, which is great. It's allowed a much more flexible approach. It's introduced the opportunity for businesses to diversify their offering and to think about how they can create alternative revenue streams. Which is a really good thing, because previously, you know, when the pandemic first kicked in, if a shop wanted to introduce a cafe in part of their retail unit, the planning system would have actually stopped them from being able to adapt quickly and just to implement that change. The changes that we've seen have allowed businesses to actually make those changes quickly without being held up by the planning system itself. So I'm going to be focusing on 3 recent changes we've seen in the last year, which was firstly a permitted development right for commercial buildings, secondly the introduction of Class E, and then thirdly a recent permitted development right for Class E to residential. So focusing on number 1, you may well have seen recently that John Lewis have actually announced that they are going to be building about 10,000 new homes. So they're going to be focusing on existing sites that they already have, but then they're also going to be looking to build on some new sites as well. And so the idea behind it is that they're going to be utilising their existing space, particularly building flats above existing Waitrose stores, and they're going to be looking to rent out those flats with fully furnished with John Lewis goods or unfurnished, and all their developments will have a concierge and a Waitrose in the vicinity. So one of the ways that they might be looking to do that is through this opportunity of this permitted development right for existing commercial buildings. So what it allows you to do is to build 2 stories on top of an existing detached commercial building. And if it's not detached, if it's a terrace building, then you can add 1 story on top of it. So the requirement is that the building has to be in use as a shop, restaurant, financial services, payday loan, betting shop, laundrette, or a combination of all of those things, or a combination with residential as well. And it allows you to build 2 stories on top of that building for residential use only. There are some mandatory requirements here, so it's not just a give a loan, standalone right that you can just add 2 stories on. You do have to apply to the council for prior approval. And then there are mandatory requirements even before that stage. So the building has to have been built between 1948 and 2018, so it's not going to apply to any sort of new build properties. It needs to be in use as one of those commercial uses I just mentioned. The building has to be at least 3 stories high, but cannot be over 30 metres once these stories are added on. And you need to apply to the council for a prior approval for a number of sort of planning considerations, such as highways, contamination, flood risk, noise, and external appearance as well. So this is a really good opportunity if you have a retail unit and you want to keep that retail use, but you might be concerned about decreasing footfall. You might just be concerned that your profits are not going to be the same as they were, and you might be looking for another revenue stream. So this gives you the opportunity to build sort of 2 stories of flats on top of your existing retail store, and you could create a rental income from that, or you could sell them off. So it sort of creates a new opportunity which wasn't there before. There's now, you may well also have seen the introduction of Class E, which was really quite a big shake-up to the planning system, I think. So previously we had quite strict use classes, so everything was categorised into a use class, and if you wanted to change from one use class to another, you needed planning permission, although there were some sort of limited permitted development rights that allowed you to swap freely between them. But what it meant was that those uses were categorised, and it restricted you from just changing the use of your property without planning permission. What Class E has now done is it has amalgamated quite a number of use classes into one use class. So it's shops, restaurants, cafes, offices, financial services, professional services, nurseries, gyms, etc. These are all now caught within Class E. So what it means is that you can change use to any of those uses because they are all Class E. It doesn't constitute development, doesn't require planning permission, doesn't need permitted development. You can literally just change from one to the other within that use class. So it's introduced this really quite broad right that wasn't there before. And again, it really allows businesses to diversify their offering. So if you've got a shop and you're concerned about footfall or concerned that people are online shopping more, you could add a cafe into your shop. It might draw more people in with this sort of service-based use. And there's nothing in the planning system that's going to hold you up from doing that. The one thing I would say is that it sounds very broad on its face, but there are a number of things you might need to consider before utilising it. So you might have a planning permission that actually has conditions on it which specifies that the property can only be in use as an office, for example. So it wouldn't allow you to just change use within that Class E. You might have a Section 106 agreement in place, which again limits the use of that property. You might have a title restriction, which might restrict the use, but I think the most obvious and most problematic thing will be your lease. So if you have a lease with your landlord for a shop, it's likely to have a permitted use clause within it, and so you will need to obviously speak with your landlord and see if they're happy for you to do so, for you to change the use of that property. But what Class E has done is really allowed businesses to diversify, which I think is a really good opportunity. And then more recently, we have seen that from the 1st of August of this year, there is now going to be a permitted development right for you to change the use of a property from Class E to residential use. Again, you still need to apply to the council for prior approval, and again, there are still some mandatory requirements there. So firstly, the property can't be over 1,500 square metres in size. It has to have been vacant for 3 months. One of the sort of potentially problematic issues is that the legislation requires that the property has to have been in use for Class E for 2 years. Now, given that Class E only kicked in September of last year, obviously nothing could be in use as Class E itself for 2 years yet. So the way it's been drafted is to require it to have been in use Class E, not one of the uses within Class E. So we'll see how that plays out. Again, it can't be a listed building, and you're still going to have to apply for prior approval as to the planning considerations of sort of noise, highways, contamination, etc. But this is quite a significant thing to happen. Obviously, Class E in itself was quite a significant change to our planning system, and now for the government to sort of go another step ahead and say you've got this really broad Class E category, and now you might be able to change anything within Class E to residential, is quite significant. Now, obviously, if you've got a retail unit and it's just really struggling, and people have tried and it's gone from different owners to different owners, and it's just not functioning, then this is a good opportunity to allow that sort of struggling retail use to be put to better use. Obviously, we have a shortfall in our housing and we do need to build more homes, but it could see quite a change to our high streets. It could see a number of retail units being changed to residential. So it's quite an interesting concept that will be interesting to see how it plays out. I'm going to be joined now by Nicole Roe, and I'd just like to ask her a few questions about some of those changes and what she sort of thinks. So Nicole, firstly, perhaps you could just sort of introduce yourself, sort of work you do, your experience. Oh, I think you might be on mute. Sorry, Nicole.
The classic problem, isn't it, with Teams? Thanks for having me. So I'm a director at Eden Planning and Development. I joined Eden only about 4 months ago. I previously worked at larger practices. I've very much got a background in retail. I started working during the supermarket race for space. So there was a lot of out of centre development, kind of literally grabbing of floor space, maximising everything. Everyone wanted large foot plates. There was no real drive for diversification at all. And obviously I've now been seeing that switch across in my work for landlords, for operators. There's been a lot more diversification and some subdividing of units again. So we're kind of coming right round in the process with the planning system.
Great.
Just going to say what we've been seeing recently is quite a few interesting sort of rollouts of new business formats, which is quite interesting. So people are actively diversifying and trying to take advantage of some of the differentiating factors that now exist in the planning system.
So what was your sort of opinion on Class E? Obviously, it was quite a big shake-up to our system. What do you think of it? Do you think it's necessary for the retail sector, or are you a bit concerned about what its effect might be?
I've personally been kind of championing almost a change to the use class system for a while, and to try and have a relaxation of planning system in town centres, because I've repeatedly seen that things happen in the market. Retailers want different things, investors want different things, and the planning system is still the same system that's been in place since the year dot virtually. So it's great to see this, because it really will help businesses to diversify and move with the times.
Great. But do you think that it might result in a decrease in retail units at all, or do you think that's, if it happens, that's a necessity anyway?
Yeah, I think it will, and I think it's a necessity. We know that there's too much retail space. There's too much retail space in town centres. We've got town centres that are sprawling, that need to be contracted. We've got out of centre retail parks that are struggling, which would perhaps be better served by having, you know, more of a leisure focus, perhaps, or even some residential introduced. So I think it'll be a good thing to reduce the amount of retail. Yeah.
You mentioned recently that you've been sort of carrying out some research internally into use class E and applications, and how local planning authorities are determining those applications. Have you seen a sort of pattern emerging yet? Are you expecting to see a sort of pattern emerging from those?
Yeah, so one thing that I was concerned about when use class E was announced was that within the use class order, it was still broken down by the different types of class E. So we've got the retail as A, kind of etc. coming down, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So I was worried that actually local authorities would continue to operate in very much the same way as they had under the old system, because they could specify the letter. So your office, if you've got an application for an office, they could say, well, notwithstanding the use class order, the permitted use is use class E, G, and then, you know, it's pointless there being this wider umbrella. Thankfully, that hasn't necessarily been the case, and so far what we've seen is a kind of a range of responses from local authorities. Most have been embracing the change and haven't been too strictly kind of enforcing those subclasses. There's only one, I don't want to name and shame who has, but a very high profile Northwest local authority, we've seen that they have been doing that. Then the next stage as we go through this is I'm going to be looking at the sort of information that people are having to submit with their planning applications to perhaps justify those wider uses. Is it the case that developers are having to submit a much larger suite of documents to prove that there isn't going to be an impact on the highways, on noise and so forth, or is it definitely as flexible as it is appearing at the moment?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it plays out. And what was your thoughts when this permitted development right from Class E to Resi was introduced? Did you sort of see it coming? Are you concerned at all that that might result in homes in sort of maybe inappropriate areas like retail parks? Again, that's a good thing. Yeah, what do you think about it?
Yeah, and I'm unsure about how much it's going to be taken up, because we had this temporarily come in for offices already previously, and we didn't see a kind of a dearth of inquiries about, or how do I go about taking advantage of this? I think people are generally kind of unsure about making such a big change across. Also, it very much depends on the values that. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. So I think it's good, and there are people that are going to, landlords that are going to take this up, and I hope that's going to be more in more areas that are kind of slightly peripheral in your secondary retail frontages. But there are still restrictions on it, so it's not going to be this sort of free-for-all, which some people might think.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. You know, there's quite a lot of criteria here, so how much of a take up do you think would be? But I mean, in terms of the other permitted development right that we talked about, these sort of commercial buildings, how do you feel about that? Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think, again, it will be much take up, or do you think it's actually quite a limited right that won't be taken up that much?
I think there'll be more take up of that, because it's an easier diversification for people to embrace than it is switching to the residential.
Yeah, and you're actually on the High Street Task Force, I believe. So is there more that you want our planning system to do? Do you think it's now done enough and we need to sort of give it time to see how it all plays out, or do you think actually there's more that you think needs to be done?
Yeah, I think a really big thing that I would like to see come in is faster moving local plan system around town centres. So rather than in the local plan system, it takes so long for local plans to be written, for the consultation periods to take place. So all of the evidence base that is put forward in support of these, like to underpin the policies, by the time the local plan comes into force, certainly for town centres, they're out of date. So I would almost like to see a drive by, or kind of a push by government to empower local authorities to be able to use development briefs more, or area action plans, but however you want to badge it, something to enable a kind of biannual review of policies within town centres. And you know, if we've got lease times for units being shortened, we're going to see more change happening more quickly in town centres, and again the planning system could struggle to keep up with that. And I think something that's kind of essential is resources for the local authorities. You know, there are means that in the system at the moment for them to be able to do things, but they simply don't have the resources. They need officers who are dedicated to town centres and the regeneration of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It is, everything just seems to be quite slow, doesn't it? So yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I guess finally, obviously we've had Simon's thoughts on the future, but what about you? Where do you see the next 12 months going? What do you think the future of retail is?
Yeah, I think 12 months is very much about recovery from COVID. It's going to be really interesting to see how everyone's shopping trends pan out. High Street Task Force have done some really good research into how people now view their town centres, and that actually people are preferring their local centres rather than the big cities. So as things open out, it'd be interesting to see whether that kind of holds true moving forwards, and if we are going to continue to see a resurgence of smaller town centres. I think that could very much happen, but I think it will be more a case of the likes of Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield will see an increase, the smaller market towns will, and the middle band could start to suffer as we have things like, as mentioned earlier, stores like Gap closing. They're not the first, and they're not going to be the last that's moving to an online or more of an online platform, and so that's going to really hit that middle tier of centre. So I think it's going to be a very mixed story for the next 12 months. We're going to see some suffer, but hopefully more start to come back from COVID. Yeah,
that's great. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. I think that was really interesting to hear your viewpoints, and thank you for coming today.
Okay, thanks Megan, thanks Nicole. So just to conclude, from a legal perspective, we expect to see a move towards turnover leases, shorter lease terms, monthly rather than quarterly rents, pandemic protection provisions, potentially a more collaborative approach between landlords and tenants, where the lease is both lease code and service charge code compliant. And just obviously bearing in mind Simon and Nicole's comments, from a market perspective, expected that retailers are monitoring closely what happens post-pandemic, and hoping that the government's flagship Future High Street Fund will help areas recover and stimulate long-term growth in the sector. Local authorities are looking for other sectors such as hospitality and leisure operators to step into the breach and utilise the space that's become available, and for residential developers to take on the larger department stores. Only time will tell, but once the restrictions have been imposed by COVID ease and consumers feel safe enough to venture from their homes following the vaccination rollout, retailers will be hoping that pent-up demand will lead to a recovery, but consumers may return to a high street that looks and feels very different to the ones they once knew. So unfortunately, we haven't got time to answer any of your questions in the chat box, but we'll do our best to get back to you following the webinar. Hopefully you found the webinar useful this morning. I'm now going to draw things to a close. So thanks for joining us and goodbye.